Hi there, welcome back. If you're listening while driving, crafting, or just resting for a moment, I'm glad you're here. If you're joining me here through YouTube, this is a long-form spoken podcast meant to be listened to slowly, more like a conversation at the hearth than a fast-paced video. So grab a nice cold drink, some comfy snacks, and settle in. Today we're stepping into the month of June, that point in the year when the world feels fully awake. The frantic rush of spring planting has mostly settled. Gardens are stretching upward. The days seem to linger forever, and people suddenly remember they own patio furniture. Trails fill up, parks get crowded. Even those of us who spent winter perfectly content hiding indoors start finding excuses to spend a little more time outside. Unless, of course, we are not on the friendliest terms with the sun's rays, at which point we stare wistfully from our patio door, avoiding the scorching of our very sensitive skin. It's a season that naturally draws our attention toward the land itself. Not just the scenery, but the places we move through every day. The patch of woods behind the neighborhood. The creek that somehow survives despite modern efforts to pave absolutely everything. The old tree that has been standing in the same spot longer than any of us have been alive. The places we know well enough to recognize, yet rarely stop long enough to truly notice. Today, we're going to wander into one of the more fascinating ideas preserved within Norse tradition, the Landvættir, often translated as land spirits. We'll explore what the sources actually tell us, how these beings may have survived in later folklore, and why so many modern pagans continue to feel a connection to them today. Along the way, we'll take a few side roads through personal gnosis and the simple act of paying attention to the places we call home. Because the most interesting questions aren't hidden in distant realms or ancient ruins. Sometimes they're waiting quietly in the woods, just beyond the edge of the parking lot. So whether you're a solitary or group practitioner, brand new to the path, or simply finding your way back again, pull up a seat, get your crafting on, and walk the virtual trails with me. You are welcome here. One of the things I love most about studying old pagan traditions is that every so often, the sources do something incredibly rude. You'll be reading along, minding your own business, feeling reasonably intelligent for once, and then a concept appears that everyone else involved seems to understand, except you. Nobody explains it or defines it either. There are no helpful footnotes, and the text simply assumes you know what they're talking about and keeps on moving. Landvættir are one of those things. Most modern pagans have heard the word at least once. Usually it gets translated as land spirits, and everyone nods as though that settles the matter of their definition. Except that it doesn't. We tend to refer to them as beings who exist both in our realm and not. Of fur, of fin, of scale, and other descriptors for present-day animals. But once you start asking what a Landvættir actually is, things become much less straightforward. When did we begin to limit them to only the things we know? Could they have been spirits? Ancestors? Local gods? Something closer to what folklore later calls hidden folk? The answer seems to be a very unhelpful yes. One of the most famous references appears in Heimskringla, written by Snorri Sturluson around the early to mid-13th century. In this book, A description of ships approaching Iceland included the expectations of captains to remove dragon-headed figureheads before making landfall. Not for military purposes, not for politics either. The concern was the local Landvættir. The spirits of the land might be frightened, or more likely, offended by these carved monsters arriving unannounced. Stop and think about that for a moment. We are given no explanation as to why this matters. The text doesn't tell us who the Landvættir are for those living at the time. It simply assumes everybody listening already understands. While frustrating to modern readers and heathens, this tells us something important to comprehending the practices of early northern peoples. These beings weren't viewed as obscure mythological creatures. They weren't rare or hidden away in some distant realm. They were considered part of the landscape itself, existing side by side with the humans of the era, as ordinary and expected as rivers, mountains, forests, and bad weather. One of the challenges I hear modern people face when approaching animistic cultures is that tendency to divide the world into categories: human, animal, object, place, and even spirit. But the old worldview is messier than that. A mountain could be a mountain, or it could also be a being. A river could be water, or it could possess intention and or a spirit. A stretch of forest could be simply trees, but it could also be inhabited. These ideas weren't necessarily viewed as contradictions. The world as it was known wasn't empty. It was well populated, not just by people, but by presences, intelligences, and neighbors. Some were friendly, some were indifferent. And there were also some best appreciated from a respectful distance. Rather like actual neighbors today, now that I think about it. Bringing this next subject up will also cause some uncomfortable feelings, whether due to a sympathy for the practices or anger at the destruction they caused. Yet, Christianity played a huge part in changing things across the board of the known world, and it is usually where modern retellings imply everything changed overnight. It is usually taught that the old gods disappeared, the old beliefs vanished, and everyone became Christian. The end. History, unfortunately, is never that tidy. People do not spend generations believing the landscape is inhabited and then suddenly wake up one morning convinced it isn't. The forests, rivers, and mountains remained. More importantly, people's experiences of those places remained. So the stories adapted by changing the names and allowing the spirits to acquire new identities. In this manner, the relationships continued even as Christianity spread and destroyed all around it. I may produce a podcast at a later time highlighting this destruction and chaos that Christianity created, but not at this time. Now, we need to see how the Landvættir survived, even into the present day. After the spread of monotheism, folklore enters the picture and begins raising some interesting questions. Scandinavia is suddenly filled with beings that sound suspiciously familiar. For example, the tomta, the nisa, the huldafolk of Iceland, farm spirits, house spirits, forest beings, mound dwellers, hidden people, local presences attached to particular places, different names, different stories. Yet many of them behave in remarkably similar ways. They dislike arrogance, They respond well to reciprocity and appreciate respect. They can help or they can hinder. Across the board, it seems that they rarely seem concerned with whether modern people believe in them. And the more folklore you read from medieval times to modern, the harder it becomes to avoid the question: did the Landvættir disappear, or did they simply change clothes? One of my favorite examples of a modern interaction comes from Iceland. In recent decades, there have been occasions where roads, construction projects, and development plans generated public discussion because certain locations were believed to be connected to hidden folk. Rather than plow ahead, the roads were diverted, and projects were put on hold until another alternative could be found. Now, whether someone personally believes in hidden people isn't what makes this interesting. It's the persistence of recognition for these spirits and beings. Why do these stories survive? Why do particular stones develop reputations? Why do some hills remain significant generation after generation? And why do otherwise practical people continue treating certain locations differently? Eventually, the survival of the tradition becomes the focal point instead of the argument about whether the tradition is true. What matters is that something is being preserved. The question then becomes, what? This is usually the point where people expect me to start talking about dramatic spiritual experiences. Unfortunately, I may disappoint you in that regard. Most of my experiences with place spirits have been profoundly ordinary. No larger-than-life creatures, no ghostly apparitions, no sparkling unicorns. There have been no mysterious figures stepping out of the trees to offer me wishes, no booming voices from the heavens to guide the path ahead. Instead, my experiences began with attention, usually when a place felt different or bigger. You may have experienced this as well. One section of a forest feels welcoming, while another feels closed. Maybe a particular tree keeps drawing your attention. You may find yourself walking down a trail that feels alive in a way that is other. Perhaps a location lingers in your thoughts long after you've left. The experience of it is subtle enough that it would be easy to dismiss, but it's also persistent enough that eventually you stop dismissing it. It's not because you've proven anything exists, it's because you've noticed something more than just the mundane. And there's a difference in that mindset. One of the questions that keeps bouncing around in the back of my mind is whether spirits have become harder to find or whether we've simply become harder to reach. Most of us move through the world at a pace that would have looked absolutely ridiculous to our ancestors. We rush from one obligation to the next, headphones in, phone in hand, mind already focused on wherever we're going instead of where we currently are. The landscape becomes something we travel through rather than something we participate in. I catch myself doing it all the time. There are days when I can walk the same path, past the same trees, hear the same birds, and retain absolutely none of it because my attention is somewhere else entirely. I'm thinking about bills, work, deadlines, mythology projects, whether I remembered to move the laundry over, and 17 other things that have absolutely nothing to do with the place my body currently occupies. Then there are other days when I slow down enough to actually notice and purposefully acknowledge a hawk sitting on a fence post. Hi, Freya. The smell of rain before the clouds arrive. Let me get home first, Thor. The way a particular patch of woods sounds different from the rest. Hello, Vidar. What's going on with you today? A tree I've passed 100 times suddenly demanding my attention for reasons I can't explain. None of those things prove the existence of spirits. They do, however, remind me how easy it is to move through the world without truly seeing it. When I read older folklore, one thing that stands out again and again is how familiar people were with their surroundings. They knew the fields. They knew the forests. They knew which hills had stories attached to them and which stretches of water deserved extra caution. Whether we interpret those traditions literally, spiritually, psychologically, or somewhere in between, they grew out of sustained attention. Modern life doesn't encourage that. It encourages efficiency, speed, productivity, and movement. One of the draws I find in the old stories is that they seem far more interested in active presence. And if Landvættir, hidden folk, or place spirits exist at all, I suspect presence is far more useful and appreciated than certainty. One of the biggest shifts in my own practice happened when I stopped treating places as locations and started treating them as relationships. That sounds much more mystical than I actually mean it. I'm not talking about introducing yourself to every tree in the county or dramatically declaring your friendship to a patch of moss. Please don't do that in public. The squirrels already think we're strange. What I mean is developing familiarity, going back to the same place repeatedly with intention, watching how it changes through the seasons, noticing what arrives in spring, what leaves in autumn, and what remains through winter, learning what belongs there and what doesn't. The first few times you visit a place, you're mostly seeing it through your own expectations. You may notice what stands out, which are probably the obvious things. Those things that fit whatever idea you already have in your head. But given time, that begins to change. Patterns start to emerge. You notice things like where water collects after a heavy rain. You may recognize which birds return every year. You might start identifying the plants that appear first in spring and the ones that linger long after everything else has gone dormant. The landscape gradually stops being scenery and starts becoming familiar. Older animistic traditions often seem less concerned with summoning spirits than they are with recognizing relationships that already exist or creating them. The assumption wasn't that the world needed to become alive. The world was already alive. The challenge was learning how we are to participate in it. There's wisdom in that. Not because every experience needs to become mystical or every strange feeling translates automatically to a spirit, but because attention itself changes the quality of a relationship. The more time you spend with a place, the more that place begins to reveal itself. I think that may be because the place itself recognizes that you are a reliable part of them now. What emerges from this is practical knowledge, perhaps a emotional connection. You may find spiritual insight. With time, it often becomes a mixture of all three. That's where conversations about Landvættir eventually lead. Not towards certainty, but familiarity. Becoming the kind of person through that conversation and relationship building who knows a place well enough to notice when something feels different. And the kind of person who understands that relationship doesn't begin with grand experiences. It begins with showing up again and again and again until one day the landscape no longer feels like somewhere you're visiting. Instead, it feels like somewhere that knows you too. One of the most valuable lessons animism ever taught me is that relationship can exist before certainty. While modern culture often demands proof first, older traditions seem more interested in participation, acknowledging a place, caring for it, paying attention, and developing familiarity. This allows you to experience a relationship unfolding without forcing it into a conclusion. Frankly, this approach has saved me from a lot of unnecessary spiritual drama over the years. Not every strange feeling needs an explanation, and not every experience needs to become a declaration. Sometimes the healthiest response is simply curiosity. The older I get, the less interested I become in proving the existence of spirits. In my practice, they do. I no longer have to convince anyone else to believe me. The more interesting observation is what happens when we begin behaving as though the world is alive. Think about it. You walk differently, perceive differently, become aware of places instead of simply passing through them. The landscape stops being scenery and instead becomes rife with possibility as you sense what lies beyond. Relationship blossoms. Maybe after all this time, that's the real inheritance of the Landvættir for us. Not a specific being or folklore creature, not even a specific belief. It's what has survived. The understanding that humans were never alone in the world. The old names may have faded and the stories changed, but the traditions evolved. The overall habit of relationship remained. Every time someone leaves an offering beneath a tree, every time someone greets a place before entering it, every time someone pauses and wonders why a particular stretch of land feels different from the surrounding countryside, the old patterns emerge again. I don't believe that the Landvættir are gone. They became tomten, nisse, Holdefolk, and 100 other local spirits. They're still exactly where they've always been, waiting patiently for people to notice them again. Thank you for sitting with me today as we explored a group of spirits that remind us that the land is never truly empty. It is filled with relationships, seen and unseen, waiting for us to slow down long enough to notice them. Next time, we'll turn our attention toward midsummer, the summer solstice, and the stories of Balder, the shining god whose tale carries both the brilliance of life at its fullest and the quiet promise of renewal beyond loss. My lovely little heathens and heathen friendlies, have a beautiful week as summer settles across the land. While you revel in the warming rays, don't forget that sunscreen and to stay hydrated. May the long daylight hours bring you warmth, good company, and a few moments beneath the open sky to appreciate just how alive this season can be. Even at the height of the sun's journey, there is wisdom in pausing long enough to simply be present. Remember your connection to the divine, and in the middle of everything swirling through the world right now, don't forget to find your sacred breath.